We introduce our panelists. Jen, Shelly, do you want to go first?
Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Jan Shelly Brown. I'm a partner at McKinsey as well. I do the bulk of my work in the digital technology space, serving financial services organizations on core technology topics. Prior to McKinsey, I spent my formative years as a developer at Goldman, building essentially trading software platforms.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Subhadaa Reddimasi, and I lead modernization and cloud adoption in Wells Fargo Technology. I've been with Wells Fargo about 2.5 years right now, and my role at Wells Fargo and the remit there is to uplift our large portfolio of applications and take them to our hybrid cloud environment. And the second part of the role is also to look at our 40,000 technologies that we have and make sure that everybody understands why we are doing cloud and how we're going to do cloud. Before that, I've spent about 14 years at JP Morgan Chase, leading cloud architecture and several different engineering functions.
Great. Good morning. My name is Cathy Horst-Forsyth, and I'm the founder and managing partner of Strongbow Consulting Group. If you're not familiar with us, our charter and mission is to help large-scale enterprise both optimize and modernize IT infrastructure. So what we used to call data center practice is now hybrid cloud, and I'm sure we'll dig into that as we talk along here.
And I should just point out, as I'm looking at my phone here, I'm taking questions from the audience. I'm not checking text messages. So why don't we start, maybe Cathy, we'll start with you, and can you talk about specific examples of cloud enabling new innovation and creating real impact in some of the enterprises you probably worked with?
Sure. Well, we'd probably be remiss if we didn't mention the CIO award winners here today who are spending time talking about their use of cloud-driven technology to really innovate top line to bottom line, externally and internally. But I think a great use case that really hits on a lot of the value was shared at the Open Network User Group last month, and it's Target, the very large retailer that you're all familiar with. They are well into the journey into multi-hybrid cloud. They started several years ago. And if you think about a retailer, of course, the elasticity is a key need. When they have to, during peak season, process 20 times the normal workload, building on-prem for that just doesn't make economic sense. So pretty basic set of values. They follow beyond elasticity, though, by really taking an open source framework and re-architecting the entire portfolio of applications, driving that into a multi-cloud solution. So they use public service providers, but they're still leveraging their on-prem demand. And because they re-architected, they can really move workloads easily to take advantage of circumstances economically and to drive better resilience. So there's another key benefit. In addition, they calibrated and drove even more cost savings given the reliance on cloud. So that wasn't why they started, but they actually were able to reduce OpEx and CapEx. But the real punchline was the top line, where they drove $16 billion in new revenue during the pandemic.
It's a terrific example. Any other favorites that either of you want to share?
Yeah, I mean, and I'm sure you can relate to this, Subhadaa, but like the idea that in financial services, like a lot of the CSPs have a ton of AI ML capabilities. So on the financial services side, you tend to see a lot of advanced analytics. If you think about fraud detection, if you think about underwriting, a lot of these core banking processes are being reimagined and quickly spun up as they're moving to cloud. So a lot of those digital workloads are use cases that of banks are moving to cloud first.
I will add a different example here, unrelated to banking. A CPG company I was talking to more recently, they talk about how you are creating capabilities which are in a specific location and target that specific location as your initial place where you want to pilot and then take it globally. Now think about trying to do that in a typical data center viewpoint that you've had before and starting to gauge and expand your business in areas where you have not done before. So the fact that you do not have to have a physical infrastructure in that location up in the Asia-Pac or in London or somewhere else, and being able to operate in a cloud environment and being able to take things to market very, very quickly. So bringing that scale and bringing that agility to market, I think, is another great use case of cloud.
And maybe, Subhadaa, I'll start with you, but anyone can answer this. just because I just talked about alignment in my keynote, any insights or advice for the crowd on how you get alignment around these kinds of initiatives?
Yeah, so I think you touched upon a lot, Steve, when you talked about this. The alignment at the CEO level and the CIO level and the board becomes extremely important so that everybody understands the why behind the cloud. When you really talk about cloud, probably 5, 6, 7 years ago, it was all about cost. It was thought of as something that we do for the purposes of cost save. But when you really peel the onion and look at it, you start thinking about the agility and the scale of being able to deliver those key experiences to your customers at rapid pace. And that's where the why behind why you're doing cloud becomes an important construct where you align and bring your CEOs along. And the business impact, like you were talking about, once everybody is behind the why, then the conversations become so much more easier.
Yeah. One thing that I think is really, really important is we see a lot of organizations, as they're defining the strategy, spend a lot of time bringing the business, the board along. As they start getting into month 6, month 9, year 1, what tends to happen is that journey becomes more insular within the IT function. So as an example, what are the applications you prioritize to move to cloud first? If it's within the IT organization, you may take a data center view. Let's think about exiting data center 1 or data center 2. Let's think about the resiliency. Let's think about different types of application architecture, and you prioritize that. Versus if you engage your business line leaders, you can be ahead of the strategy. What are the key segments we want to drive into that will allow these set of applications to move first, which may be a different prioritization versus what the IT organization would have done, right? So I think having the business, having the CEO and the board at various steps, even with the most innocuous decisions, I think become really important.
So let's shift to the pandemic a second, because I think it's very interesting. As the pandemic hit, many businesses had to move online. They had to scale new capabilities very rapidly. Maybe talk a little bit about, and maybe Cathy, I'll start with you. What surprised you the most about how companies responded and how industries responded to the pandemic?
I think it's a simple example, but it's changing the way we're going to work long into the future, and it's work from home. Multiple hundreds of thousands of employees, knowledge workers, really overnight, over the weekend, being able to, without any major negative ramification, connect and continue to work. If we can imagine if that hadn't happened, what would have the consequences been? So I think a lot of confidence was really built around the fact that Teams, WebEx, Zoom, any of those connectivities really kept work running, and it worked. There was no, it really proved in the concept and maybe gave some confidence as to what the next steps and the next growth opportunities will be from cloud.
I think what I found quite interesting in any context, whether you're dealing with public or social sector clients, or even dealing with high-performing kind of technology organizations, the pace of rollout of products and services was astronomical, right? And what I think now that we're moving kind of into an endemic phase, the normal cadence is starting to creep back in. And what cloud will allow you is sort of that foundational technology agility, but a lot of the cumbersome business or enterprise processes, how we fund, how we approve, how we release things, a lot of those were reimagined, put to the side during the pandemic, and they're creeping their way back in now.
I think it's amazing what you're saying, right? Because when you think about it, it was a necessity when the pandemic happened for us that we operate very, very quickly and react very, very quickly. So we didn't have the time to sit back, think, let's wait another 6 months to figure out how we're all going to be operating online and in a hybrid mode or completely for a certain point of time where we could not get into offices or anywhere. So it was a necessity that drove us to the place where we had to get, at least for Wells Fargo, we had 200,000 employees, all needed to be remote at the same point of time. That scale made you think differently, right? Made you have to innovate differently.
Yeah.
Now, when you start making decisions rapidly, which previously took years, To your earlier point of Moderna, right? You think about how vaccinations were approved. It took years for you to do that. You didn't have that luxury of time anymore.
Right.
Now you start questioning your processes differently right now and say, oh, well, I could actually do this in 45 days. Now, why the heck was I spending like 2 years doing this? That now energizes people in a different way to do cloud.
That's right. And let me, just to maybe belabor this point one more, I'll turn the question on its head, and maybe Jen, Shelly, you can give us some thoughts on what if the pandemic happened 15 or 20 years ago when the cloud wasn't around? How would life have been different?
I mean, I think we would have innovated as a human race. I would like to be hopeful and think so. But I think it became drastically easier, right? Whether it is we can tap sort of the Googles of the world and think about how contact tracing applications got spun up, or whether remote work, as you spoke about, Cathy, got enabled, and it changes how we work today, right? What that future of work looks like for many of our organizations. I think 15 years ago, we may have had much more significant supply chain issues. We would have struggled to figure out how to interact across geographies in the same way. A lot of it were enabled differently based on the technology, I think, today.
I suppose we would have waited longer for vaccines.
100%.
That is
This
true.
would not happen.
That is true.
Yeah.
So let's shift to migration and execution a bit. And I'm going to, and Subhadaa, maybe I'll start with you, because it'd be interesting to get some experiences on migrating to the cloud. What are some of the lessons you've learned that you wouldn't have imagined starting out? And maybe what would you have done differently? And I want to also, not to pile on too much on the question, but there's some questions in here around how did you get started? What were some of the biggest hurdles you encountered that I'm getting from the audience? So maybe we can start with you and just start talking about some of the lessons learned.
Absolutely. I think the first lesson learned is acknowledging that it's not going to be easy, right? And the second lesson is it's not going to be overnight either, right? And when we talk about large organizations, which have organically grown for years and years, right? And they have a lot of baggage that they carry. I think it's important to be able to take a step back and, like I said before, think about why do you want to do it? And from your perspective as well, to prioritize what is of business value for us in the context of how you're migrating to cloud. So take the time to assess your portfolio. Use the tools that are available from intelligent tools that are available for you to look at it from a perspective of what are the pockets where you need agility and what are the pockets where you don't. Now, when you really think about banks and your customer-facing applications and your applications where you have not touched for years and are just running the show for you, that prioritization is important to say, where is it that I have the need for rate of change, and how do I prioritize differently? So from the lessons learned perspective, I would say 2 things. One, understand your portfolio well enough, understand your whys, and prioritize well.
And when you say, because that is one of the questions in here, when you say understand your portfolio well enough, just could you expand on that a little bit?
Absolutely. So when you're talking about any large bank, you will see that approximately you have like 5,000, 6,000 applications in your portfolio. Now, when you look at that and you're talking about taking the cloud, and I will specifically talk about hybrid cloud here, which would mean that you would have an on-premise version of the cloud and you have a public cloud version of the cloud. Now, when you think about your portfolio and those interactions between your applications, it's very important to make a decision of what goes where and how do they interact with each other, so that as you are taking advantage of the public cloud environment for whatever reasons, whether it's big data, analytics, or whether it's scalability to your point earlier, you still have to consider that interactions so that they are seamless. So to be able to understand the dependency map of your applications, the second part of it is to be able to understand the complexity of the applications that you're dealing with, right? What is going to be my biggest problem when I take this application to cloud? Maybe I have not done telemetry properly in this application. Maybe I have not done logging properly in my application. Maybe it's not secure enough. So ability to use software intelligence tools to understand your portfolio before you're making that decision to go to cloud becomes very important. Otherwise, you're going to backtrack.
Agreed.
Anything you want to?
One thing, and I touched on it earlier, but to bring it to life is we see a lot of organizations, you're focused on the infrastructure side, right? So how do you get your development teams to spin up infrastructure that's scalable, that allows this agility? But when you look at what it takes to deliver products to market end to end, one organization I work with, it's like 20 months. But if you were to build that value chain, the provisioning piece, it is a pain point. It takes about 3 months out of that 20 months. So what are the other like go-to-market pieces, funding pieces? Are you aligned with your business, right, on the timing of releases that are really enabling you to go faster, preventing you from going faster, that you need to rethink, right, that will allow you to unlock this real value Subhadaa is describing? If you don't do that alongside your cloud migration, you will get to cloud and find that you're not getting the benefits of agility that you expected. So that's one big failure mode I would say to look out for.
Yeah. I would add one of the things that sometimes is surprising and definitely an impediment is when the organization doesn't change operationally and structurally to support this change. So a simple example is application developers developing without thinking about the application attributes and how infrastructure is going to handle that, and vice versa, infrastructure teams over constraining the environment so the application developers can't reap the benefits of cloud infrastructure. So how do you bring these two organizations who don't necessarily talk in a typical organization together to collaborate and get to the same endpoint? So you're really, when you're talking about having ongoing support from the board level and the C-suite, it's about organizational change and then cultural change too. I think some of the best examples of successes in the cloud have come from an engineering-led philosophy. For sure, but certainly with collaboration and integration in a different way that most org charts don't support as written today.
And talent, right, is a huge thing when you think about as a challenge, right?
Talent is
the people, right, in the organization. When you start thinking about, I really want to go to cloud, I think the other big question is how prepared are we?
Yeah.
Right?
And do you understand what you're committing to? Yeah.
And being able to look at it from that perspective and say, people have operated for the last 20 years in a certain manner. The DevOps construct, can we look at that, peel that onion and see, assess where are we from that perspective and be prepared from that aspect as well, I think is an important thing.
Yeah, let's explore that a little bit more because I think this question of organizational change management is huge in cloud transformations. Cathy, you started down this path, and I think it's probably worth understanding. What are some of the challenges organizationally, more broadly outside of just the IT organization that you have to face into?
Yeah, well, I think we've touched on, the business and working directly, and maybe not a popular answer, but you've got politics and organizational inertia, lines of business that have a strong affinity and alignment with the way they've done things and the way they believe things should be done. Now, at the same time, they understand the business and what value can be driven, so they're an important part of the equation, but do they really want to change and accept change? And how do you really ask technology and business to partner in a way to drive that change? It's just not a natural act that happens in business today. And I think, when you talk about the business wins and elevate that at the board level, it will create some accountability to really follow through with that. And I think that's one of the things that's missing. And when you talk about companies getting stuck in the journey, lack of accountability, whether it's the revenue generation and the business change that's been advertised, where is that? Or the efficiency, or we haven't talked about, failed business cases because they just go on and on and on as the migrations are extended. And instead of getting the benefits, you're really straddling two worlds and spending twice as much.
Yeah. One tension I tend to see a lot, building on something you said earlier, Cathy, is the CIO is very excited about going to cloud. Did a great job, works with the business, gets the business case defined. The CISO is late to the party. And so what is that tension to make sure you go to cloud, but you have the right enablers from a cloud security perspective in place? How do you shift left security so your developers are a true front line for the organization, right? And they have the latest on how to think about security as code, and they're thinking about developing software in a way that's secure by design, right?
Basically asking CIOs to be master diplomats.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
So I do want to come back to this issue of security and cybersecurity. But before we go on, because there are a couple questions here related to kind of goals and ambition in the organization. And you touched on this, Cathy, but I don't know, Subhadaa, maybe you can talk to the importance of organizational goals and ambition around your cloud and what that looks like for people. And also then how you build momentum around that goal and ambition.
So the goals and ambitions of organizations are based on I think, many things, right? One is, when you think about large organizations right now, a lot of the large organizations are really talking about how they continue to want to become customer focused and being able to deliver capabilities very, very quickly to their customers. But when we really talk about cloud, to the point that Jan was making before, you see that they're driven by cost saves, right? It starts with a business case, to your point, and people focus a lot on that business case being, what is the immediate benefit that I'm going to get to cloud? So the acknowledgement to say that, okay, cloud is a journey, right? And it's probably a 10-year journey or a 12-year journey or a 15-year journey. And being able to acknowledge that as an organization and understand that it's going to take that evolution, I think is an important thing. So from a goal standpoint, I think there's a vision aspect of it to say, okay, where do I get in 10 years? And then there is milestones of what you can do immediately versus what you can do in the next couple of years. I think that alignment is extremely important, is what I'd say. And then to the earlier point that we were trying to make, to look at where is value and partner with your business partners to actually say, okay, if I have rate of change and delivery of certain capabilities that get accelerated by using cloud, is that a focus area? And how do we make sure that we as an organization stand behind that so that we can move forward with those goals? I think that's where I would start.
I do think the goal has to be somewhat ambitious, right? Has to be even lofty, because I do think the most successful organizations I've seen with the adoption have been the ones where there's a forcing function that may be bigger than the organization. If we don't get out of our data centers, the costs go up twice the amount. Or we sold the data center by this time frame, right, to a hyperscaler, right? And we have to get out of it. Because what tends to happen is the huge tension between delivery to customers, right, your portfolio, how do you get things out of the door, versus maybe addressing this level of technical debt so that we can migrate an application to cloud, right? It's going to be a constant trade-off. So having something that is bigger than just, yes, oh, we should move to cloud, right, is often usually a good impetus.
Let me, I want to, there's a couple questions around cost. Both, is it really, significantly more or less? And also this question about the shift from CapEx to OpEx and financial operations. I just wonder, and maybe Subhadaa, I'll start with you, and then Cathy, you can weigh in on, maybe just for the audience, what are some of the considerations around costs that the audience should be thinking about as they embark on their journeys?
Yeah, I think it's important to understand that you're going to have a bubble cost, right? When you're thinking about especially that journey, and you think about hybrid cloud, which includes public and private, a lot of times you're looking at not necessarily taking a full workload or full application to cloud when you start with it. You're going to take portions of your workloads, portions of your portfolio to cloud. So you have all of those lots of interactions that happen, egress of data that happens that you have not planned for, which makes you see that many times when you initially go to cloud, you actually have increased your cost versus actually decreased your cost, right? And that happens for the first many, many years till you get to the point where you've learned how to operate in cloud effectively. We were talking about this before. I think as much as it's hard to move your portfolio of applications to cloud, the harder part is actually to operate in cloud, to optimize actually being in cloud, right? So while the journey is not, is just the beginning of the journey when you take your applications to cloud, right? So when I talk about the fact that the cost, and it's important to look at it in the longer term versus in the near term, and start thinking about it from that perspective is actually going to be helpful for the organizations to think about the right why as to why they're doing cloud as well.
I would love to just emphasize that point, because I think one of the things I can see consistently across our enterprise clients is that they underestimate the length of time and overestimate the speed at which applications can move to the cloud or software as a service, and then legacy infrastructure can be turned down. So what you wind up with is two worlds and two sets of books. But broadly speaking, I would tell you that most of our clients now, thankfully, they don't talk about moving to cloud for cost savings. There is a business case that has to be metered and measured and reported upon with frequency so that you can show those wins and show the progress that executives want to see. But it is about top line revenue innovation. That conversation has shifted. Although we do hear clients say, cloud is not a savings for us. Some will acknowledge that they've done the math and they see that the efficiencies are with traditional data center infrastructure. So the point would be, there's no one answer. It sounds like it's always cheaper to go cloud, but the world of FinOps exists because of the surprises, the economic surprises that companies are dealing with. There's a whole now need to focus on, as you say, operationally sustaining the economics of cloud. And that's where a lot of our early adopters and migrators to cloud are now focused. And you mentioned CapEx and OpEx. I mean, it sounds kind of simple. It shifts. But companies are comfortable dealing with capital. You can divide it by a depreciation cycle and predict it. Now you're taking consumption and pushing it to the edges of the organization where you can't even see what's happening. So it's a huge challenge. And really, I would say the advice would be think forward to after the migration and plan early.
That's a great point. Why don't we talk a bit about talent? Because that comes up a lot in cloud. And it has many dimensions to it. And maybe you can, and JSB, I'll probably start with you, but it'd be great to understand both what are some of the challenges you think organizations have to face with cloud. And it's everywhere from my current employees and their understanding and what it means for them, as well as I hear many clients say, it's hard to hire young talent if we're not in the cloud already. Because so anyways, maybe just talk about some of the challenges and then we can expand on that, because I think this is a big and important topic.
Yeah, I think two thoughts, right? One is the success stories I see is, as you're thinking about your overall migration, to think about what your talent evolution is going to look like, right? And one piece of talent is kind of like the training aspects of it, right? So if you're operating in GCP or Azure, right, making sure your developers are adequately and appropriately trained, especially on things like FinOps and how to do SRE and how to do kind of product in a new way, right? The full toolkit of it. The other piece of it I think is actually really important is, how do you get people to work differently, which is sort of this organizational change management. The good news on one hand of it is, I think externally, Steve, you alluded to this, is there's a vast workforce out there that is excited about working in cloud technology, so you'll be able to attract that type of talent and bring them into the organization. But you currently have a bench of talent within the org. So how do you evolve it so that you can create an ecosystem but that actually moves the organization forward as opposed to the friction? So you do need to think about not just the training and the attraction, but also the kind of evolution, right, of your culture as you're moving forward.
Yeah, I think I'll add to that. I think there's three facets of talent broadly when you think about technology talent in the organizations, right? One is the developer workforce that we were talking about, who were very used to building applications and then relying on the infrastructure engineers to figure out what infrastructure they need to operate. That changes with cloud. So now you're really talking about to the upskilling aspect of it, where you're saying, okay, you as a developer now need to understand what you need to operate your application with it. What's the boundary? What's the scale that you need? You need to start thinking about what infrastructure. Like when you really talk about, oh, do you need a 4x12 or an 8x16? And now you're looking at the developer's looking, okay, I don't know, my infrastructure engineer did that before, right? So there is that upskilling aspect of it so that you make sure the developer understands now that next layer, which they did not spend a lot of time before. Now let's talk about the cyber and security organization, right? Now the way that was before was slightly different. You operated in the premise, you had your boundaries very set, and you had perimeter level security defined in a certain way, and you were very comfortable operating in that perimeter security, right? Now when you take that and you stretch it to the hybrid cloud environment, now there is a shared responsibility pattern that comes into place there, and you start to acknowledge that presence, and you start thinking about that differently. Right? Now, no trust models that we talk about, and bringing that to bearing, understanding what that means to your firm and your security developers and your firewall developers, all of that has changed. So to be able to acknowledge that upfront, understand what that means, and be able to operate is a big thing. Then the third set of folks, which we usually overlook when we start talking about cloud, is our infrastructure. So there's a change in dimension when you think about our infrastructure engineers and that organization, which previously managed our data centers hugely, right? Now there's a fear of, oh, I'm not going to have a job now, right? So now how do you take that and make it more effective to say, okay, your job now has changed, right? So those are the facets that I'd leave you with.
Maybe Cathy, let me just expand on this a little bit, because this is a great breakdown you did, Subhadaa. And one of the questions I have, and maybe I'll put an opinion out here as part of a question. Cloud now exposes people outside the IT organization who are frontline workers, maybe leading a business unit, to technology in ways that they never would have been exposed before, which in some ways may make organizations educational institutions. And maybe you can talk a little bit about what the cloud's impact is on the front line of the business and what that means, and even customers of the business, and how do you upgrade skills there? How do you think about that?
I think there is no longer a separation between technology and business, period. You know, if you want to run a business, if you want to make money, if you want to sell a product, how can you do that without technology? So to a sense, it's not upskilling. We talk about talent engineering, which is necessary. It really is upskilling the entire organization to think about business differently, to be open to technology. And a point I just wanted to add, again, when we talk about talent, it's usually internal talent, and investing in bringing that into the core, super important, and I think best practice. But 90% of enterprises rely upon third-party managed service suppliers to manage parts of their IT infrastructure. And there's not a lot of conversation about how that outsourcing, that traditional outsourcing, which has grown up over time, is now going to be undone to kind of shift knowledge and capability. And we see a wide range of some relationships are working really well, and others are, the clients are stuck with a lack of transparency, and they can't even begin with the technology. So
that's a great point, and a super interesting one. Why don't we pivot to security now? We started a little bit down that path, so now we can go down it all the way. And I'd love to hear perspectives. There's a bunch of questions here around security as an obstacle to cloud migration. And Subhadaa, there's some for you specifically around regulatory requirements in banking, but I think that can be true in any regulated industry. So it'd be interesting to hear some thoughts, and maybe Subhadaa, I'll start with you, and I want to come back to also geopolitical instability, because there's a lot going on now in this whole space, and lots to think about and unpack.
Yeah, I think, like I was saying before, preparedness matters, right? And to be able to acknowledge and understand how are you going to operate differently from a security perspective in a hybrid cloud environment is very important. And to take your CISO and not just the CISO, but all levels of the organization of security together with you on the journey is extremely important. So when we partner with many of the CSPs, the cloud service providers, whether it is Azure or Google, we have very deep conversations about, okay, how are we dealing with this from a security standpoint, trust standpoint, protection standpoint? What does the data protection look like? How are we going to encrypt our data? Because now when we're talking about customers' data, it's people like you and I. We're talking about our data, right? It's very important to be able to understand how are we going to make it secure from the start, and that becomes part of our design and strategy while going towards cloud. And coming to the regulatory conversation, the other important aspect of it is, yes, we are a regulated industry, and we have to acknowledge that we are a regulated industry for the right reasons, right? Because we are dealing with, like I said, our own data when you talk about it. And to be able to work with the partners who understand that and are able to bring that capability to the table is extremely important. Jan and Cathy and me were talking before, right? When you look at the large firms like Google, like Azure, Google specifically, they are a data company, right? Who does data better than Google? Right? Now, when you start thinking about that and turn around and say, okay, how do they protect their data? And how do we really use those learnings for the benefit of banking industry? Yeah. Yes, there might be nuances from a regulatory standpoint, but those learnings are still learnings.
Yeah, I agree. I think, it's interesting. If you look at data, piggybacking on what you said, there's a lot of innovation from a security perspective that the CSPs are bringing to the table. So if you are running in their environment, you can benefit from that. So much so that if you look at where a lot of the breaches, the public ones are, 90+% of them are because of configurations, not because of the underlying technology, right? What that means is the organization needs to think about how do you shift where your policies and your security is implemented as code. How do you teach your developers to configure these capabilities, security as design, not that the capabilities don't exist, right? That's one. And I think to the point of like, whether it's pharma, whether it's healthcare, whether it's banking, any highly regulated organization, whether it is, if you have a 3 lines of defense and you have a risk organization, you have an audit and compliance, or even externally with your regulator, what you need to think about is how are they doing checks on your policy and security as code? So the failure mode we see, again, is security technology may have shifted to automated controls in the platform. Life is great. How are you going to explain that to your auditor? How are you explaining that to your second line? That's where the shift comes in, because they are still looking for checklists, right? So how do you educate them? How do you bring that along? And that's where I think a lot of the learning, training, and capabilities need to shift as well.
And just to put a point in, I don't think security will ever be outsourced to a hyperscaler or anyone else. In fact, I think some of the statistics show that, the failures happen inside the organization. So it's really not an existential question of, do I do it here or do I do it in the cloud? It's how can you afford not to? I mean, what happens to companies who decide that, no, we can't afford the risks, despite the fact that the hyperscalers are investing in the best, most secure technology that anyone can? What's the cost of doing nothing? I don't hear, sometimes we have to ask that simple question and say we can't afford not to.
Yep. Yeah. Interesting. So let's talk a little bit about the hyperscalers, because the market's very concentrated. There's 3 big ones, then there's lots of vendors out there who are building services. How do you, and maybe Subhadaa, I'll start with you, how do you build the right ecosystem of support for your cloud migration? Like, who should be involved with you on the journey, and how have you used the hyperscalers and others?
Yeah, so let's talk about the what we were referring to, right, from a standpoint of regulators, right? You take that lens and say, okay, when we're really talking about how regulators are looking at us as a banking industry or a pharma industry or a health services industry, I think to be able to understand and evaluate those partners who understand that industry and have been there, done that, and are able to be that partner in crime for you to be along in the journey becomes the important evaluation aspect of picking the right partner, right? And yes, you're right in saying there's 3 major cloud service providers when you talk about it, but at the same point of time, when you evaluate those CSPs and look at it from a perspective of who is the right partner, who has done a significant banking scale or a significant healthcare scale or a significant pharma scale, then you probably are starting to peel that onion differently. Now, coming to the partners from a migration perspective is the same thing, right? To be able to compare who've done large-scale migrations to the cloud. And let me point there in the right way, right? I think that's an important thing there, because there's a lot of companies who've done a quick lift and shift of applications and then realized, oh, maybe it was not the right thing, right? So to be able to think about your own strategy of why you're doing it, and if modernization is a big part of your strategy, and at least doing the minimally required stuff before you get your portfolio of applications to cloud, and if that's the part of your strategy, then to be able to partner with the right set of partners who bring that tooling to the table, who have done those things in cloud and evaluate those aspects becomes very, very important. And doing that at scale, right? Because when you're really talking about large banks or large industries, you're really dealing with thousands of applications in their portfolio, right? And to be able to evaluate where is business value, and you have the right tools to evaluate the right business value, and looking at it from a perspective of uplifting those applications minimally to operate effectively in cloud so that I'm not draining my pocket,
Yep.
I think becomes important.
Yeah, I think that I've heard from the hyperscalers themselves, they're happy to take lift and shift. I mean, they'll run it. So is that, and it's not to take away from the value that they bring to the market, which is significant, but partner and supplier, is a line to play with. And partnering with someone to really think about if you can find someone outside the firm, but within the firm, the application strategy, the business strategy, I think it starts there.
Right.
And certainly finding help outside. But I think I struggle with anyone really thinking that you can outsource or out-partner, learn from others' mistakes for sure, but I would just say it comes down to that application strategy and knowing what's best fit for purpose and then building the roadmap from the implementation roadmap from there.
Yeah. One thing we do see, though, is don't cherry pick by application, because then everything is a snowflake, and that's harder to manage. So we do see a consolidation, call it with 2 or so CSPs, particularly if you're highly regulated. You want to have that primary, secondary construct, as opposed to you have a flavor of all, which is operationally really hard. And then the other thing, alluding to what you said, Cathy, is make sure there are a lot of partnerships. So how can you leverage some of these hyperscalers, these CSPs, to help you trade? How can you leverage some of your migration partners to help you do that workforce shift that you need to as you're going through the migration? So I think there's a push towards that in the industry from a partnership perspective.
Yeah, and I think those relationships are going to grow and change over time as
Right.
really more
Yeah.
and more as the hyperscalers. I don't know what the new word's going to be. What's the new bigger hyper?
Yeah.
It's hard to imagine more.
Just one quick question on this too, because I anecdotally hear a little less about this than I did before, but a lot of talk about vendor lock-in. Is there any reflections on vendor lock-in that you have, and how concerned should people be?
Yeah, I think senior leadership tends to be really concerned about it. And it is real, right? Vendor concentration risk is a thing. So which is why I think the convergence around 2 is important. I do think from a technology architecture perspective, you can architect your cloud foundation in such a way to minimize that risk, but it's a harder explanation to a board, to your earlier point. Like it gets really technical very quickly, and it doesn't give your regulators comfort, frankly speaking, right? So people tend to converge around 2 to manage that, although I would say a lot of it tends to be reputational, not technical risk.
Very true, right? So I usually start by saying, don't you have vendor lock-in today?
Right.
Right. So when you start thinking about your current environment in data centers, think whatever mainframe, mid-range, client side. Think about the IBMs of the world. Think about you have vendor lock-in all over the place. You just don't acknowledge it, right?
Yeah.
But at the same point of time, when you think about cloud service providers, yes, there are strategies that you could use to minimize vendor lock-in, to your point. But when you really think about where is your vendor lock-in, the layer is data. You can do whatever you want to do from a compute standpoint. You can do whatever you want from a containerization standpoint. Okay, I want to be able to move compute very, very quickly. But when you really migrate data, and there's data gravity that you're talking about, that's the hard thing to move. That has always been the hard thing to move, whether it's the mainframes you're talking about or any other platforms that you have, right? So to be able to think about that strategy up front, and yes, you should have your plan A, plan B to say, okay, what if this vendor fails? It's not about being able to quickly eject. It's about being able to be prepared to say, okay, if this happens, do I have a plan, right? And that was the case even on premise, right? And even your typical plans of DR on premise had those thought processes in, right? But you just didn't think about it the same way before. So the preparedness is the big part of the vendor lock-in, is what I'd say.
So maybe in just the couple of minutes we have left, we can just look ahead. This is a fast-moving space, and the pandemic's accelerated it. We've talked about that. Maybe, and we'll just go down the line, starting with you, Cathy. I'd just love to hear some reflections on, if you were to tell the audience, what are 1 or 2 things that you think major trends in cloud and cloud migration that will affect what the audience does over the next few years, and maybe how things might look different 5 years from now could be a way to answer it.
It's interesting to think about. I think one that is more certain and less conjecture is the need to have green cloud and sustainable cloud. There, you know, we talk about hyper-scaling, hyper-growing, and the journey just beginning for large enterprise. They are major consumers of energy, and I don't know that there's an easy answer as to how that can become sustainable. So I think we'll see that unfold. The thing I'm less sure about and more curious about is how the market dynamics evolve. And, you know, it's not just about market concentration and market power and federal regulations of size. It's about concentration of commerce and critical infrastructure and our world really becoming, as it is on the utility side or clean water, drinkable water. I mean, we're relying upon this. So what does scale mean to safety and security and critical infrastructure, and what might the government do to maybe start to unpack or think about that differently beyond the regulations that affect business today? So I really have no idea how that might shape up, but something will come to bear, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think the interesting aspects of it is to bring the humane aspect into the cloud, right? When you really talk about the data and analytics, which was like a big part of why many big companies started looking at cloud to say, okay, there's capabilities that are available in the cloud that I can really put to good use very, very quickly. And then you start talking about those data analytics and models, et cetera, but to bring the humane aspect into it, right? To be able to say, how certain am I, and bring the dynamics of everything that we are seeing and the decision making, and being able to validate your decision making in the context of diversity that we are seeing, right? I think becomes another important aspect that comes into learnability in the context of cloud. I'll go on the record and say, I still think we are very much in our infancy on the cloud. So to be able to understand FinOps in cloud, right? The fact that the way we were talking about cloud is not going to be cheap if you don't do it right, right? To be able to understand that, acknowledge that, and know that we are in the learning part of the journey, right? And being able to tap those unknowns and start modeling for those unknowns, that's what I see the next 3 to 5 years to be it.
I'm completely with you. I think the ambition is clear. The ones who have said and started executing on it will be first to grab the prize, right? Whether you think about it tactically with the partnerships providers are offering, they will see and benefit a lot from that from a consumer perspective as well. I think the challenge will be for this group is, what do you do with your portfolio, right? Because you have a bunch of distributed systems that you can easily think about that goes. The next horizon are those juggernauts running in the data center, right? The mainframes, right? The ES400s. What do you do with that such that you can be ready, right? To carve out a lot of those capabilities and actually get fully in a cloud world.
And to your point, that's the part where you really think about agility differently. Because when you really think about the applications, the distributed environment, they can be a little more agile compared to those crown jewels you have had in the organizations forever. So how do you hollow out those so that you can enable your business in a different way so that you get that benefit of agility that you're really wanting to get when you go to cloud becomes an important facet as well.
That's right.
Well, thank you. With such a huge topic like cloud, it's a generational shift, and there's many topics we could mine. I could imagine going on for another 45 minutes, but I don't think that's called for in the agenda. I just want to thank all three of you. I found it fascinating to listen to your insights and thoughts here, and appreciated the wide range of topics you were willing to touch on today, and thanks again.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you all.